Hey friends of Keycloak, nice to see you again. This is Niko. Of course, you all know that you can store users' data in Keycloak's database, of course, the default settings. Perhaps you already have configured an LDAP server or Active Directory as an user storage for user federation. But sometimes it might be the case that you already have an external data source where your users' data live and you want to connect this to Keycloak. Or in certain cases, you want to store the Keycloak's users' data in a separate external data source. Today, in this video, I will show you how to do this with custom user storage providers. When working with the Keycloak admin UI, you have in the menu at the left the entry User Federation. And with the User Federation, you can connect Keycloak with an external data source and to let Keycloak store and manage the users from an external data source. So the default data sources built in Keycloak are Kerberos protocol or LDAP protocol for connecting LDAP server or Active Directory server. And you can see this at the Add Provider drop-down box. It's the Kerberos and the LDAP. These are the default built-ins. And today I provided a Peanuts user provider example for implementing an own provider connecting to an API in my use case, but it's not restricted to using the API. You can connect to a database, to every data source. You can connect through any code. And now just let's configure the Peanuts user provider. Give it a simple name. That's the Peanuts API. We have a base URL for our service that's running currently on AWS. We need username and we need a password for this, for authentication. And yeah, this is completely custom configured. I show you later in the code how you can do this. And then you can set some cache settings. These are defaults for user providers. We just leave it for the default cache settings, hit save, and our user storage provider is already configured. And if we switch now to the users tab and hit on view all the users will be displayed, which are retrieved via the API and the user federation. So you can connect to external user data sources of any kind. You can query through an API, through an SDK, through database connections, whatever you like. And you see here some members of the Peanuts family, and these have the username, email, last name, and first name. And if we go into one of these users, the Charlie Brown, we see also the email, first name, and last name. We see the storage origin is the Peanuts API, which just configured. So Keycloak knows this user is coming from the Peanuts API, and you can also see this in the ID of the user. So this ID is constructed identity of the UUID of the user provider, which just configured with a preceding F colon, F of federation. And we have this federation provider with the UUID 4DBD, whatever, and a suffix of the primary key, the ID of the external data source. So Charlie is the username and the ID of the external data source of the Peanuts API. And this will be concatenated to the user ID F, the UUID of the federation configuration, and the external ID of the user. So we can just have a look to the Peanuts API to compare the UUID. You can see here the provider ID of the Peanuts API is 4DBD0. And if you go back to the users, you can see all. So this UUID is here. And if you go to the list, you can see every user here is starting with this federation UUID because they are all coming from the external database. They have also some other attributes. Besides first name, last name, email, we have a birthday, and we have a gender. In this example, the credentials will let know Keycloak that the password is handled from the Peanuts API user federation. We don't, Keycloak does not handle the password itself. And we have some role mappings. And we can see here we have a role named child for Charlie, because Charlie is a child of the Peanuts. And Charlie is in the group Peanuts. And if we go to another Peanut, let's say Snoopy. Snoopy also has first name. Snoopy doesn't have a last name, has attributes and also credentials. Snoopy has another role, has a role animal, and also the group Peanuts, because they're all coming from Peanuts. And the nice thing here is we don't need having these groups and roles created in Keycloak, which the users are belonging to in the external provider, as long as we don't want to manage these groups in Keycloak or assigning other attributes or whatever. So if you go to the groups menu, you see there is no group created, and at the roles we don't have any of the child or animal roles in the groups. You don't have a Peanuts group, but our users have a role child and a group Peanuts. Great. So we can also authenticate, of course, with these users data, and you can just log in with Charlie, and Charlie has a password, and this password will be compared against the data of the external data provider. And yeah, we are authenticated, logged in, and we can see we have username Charlie, Charlie Brown, first name is Charlie, last name is Brown, and we can do all the things like any other user can do, because for Keycloak it's just a regular user. In all the management for tokens, for assigning roles, groups, whatever, it's for Keycloak it's just a regular user like any other user also. But only the source of the user is coming from the external data source. So let's switch to the IDE and have a look into the code and compare it to what we have here in our user federation. As usual, we're starting with the provider factory. In our case, the UserStorageProviderFACTORY of type the Peanuts user provider, which is the actual implementation of our logic. So the provider factory, as usual, has some provider ID, which gets returned from the getID method. We have a create method, which just returns a new user provider instance with the session and the current model. We have a help text, and we have the configuration, the config properties. So we can build up our own configuration for the user provider. And here are the base URL, username and password for authentication for the API. And that's the place where we configure these. Where is it? Here, where we configure the base URL, basic auth username, basic auth password. So these fields will be auto-generated by the Keycloak UI if we configure them here in the get config properties. You see here the base URL, username, password. There's some help text and some type of string and password. So if you set the property type to password, you get masking here in the UI. Nice feature. You can set default values. Also, if you have select box, you can set various options if needed. In our case, just regular text inputs are rendered, because that's enough for us. So also to the config property definition itself, you can configure a validation of the configuration. So in our case, just testing if all the fields are filled. If one field is not filled, is still blank, I will throw an exception, and this will look like this. If I miss some field and I try to save all this, I get an error, configuration not properly set, please verify. This is the message I'm throwing with the exception, and then I can enter the value and I get a success message. That's exactly the message here. When the validation fails, configuration not properly set, please verify. So there are a few other methods you can override, but these are the basics, the minimum you should do. Most of the times you need some kind of configuration. Where's the database located? Where's the user service locator or whatever? You should validate your configuration, of course, that everything is entered as much sensible as needed, and of course the provider ID and the create method to return the actual provider. So let's dig into the provider. So our Peanuts user provider has a constructor, and in this constructor I'm initializing a REST client, a REST easy client for accessing the external service via chucksRS. For this, I'm retrieving the HTTP client provider from Keycloak so that I don't have to configure my own HTTP client, so I can reuse the Keycloak internal HTTP client. And I can get this from the session, get provider, and with this HTTP client, I can build up a REST easy client. And this client definition I have put to the Peanuts client, and in this Peanuts client interface, I have defined the various endpoints, the resources, which will get called in our user provider. So we have a list of the peanuts, we have a count, we can retrieve a peanut by an ID, and we can get credential data, and we also can update credential data because our user service also allows to update a user's credentials, so the password in our case. So that's done in the constructor of the Peanuts user provider. And by the way, all this code, as in every video from me, you can find the link to this code in the video description, to a link on the GitHub repository where you can look up the code in detail. So then we have several other methods. We have the close, of course, the default method for all these providers. And we have the support credential type is configured for, so that Keycloak knows which credentials to handle with this user provider. In our case, it's just returning that we are using the password. The password credential model type is just password, a built-in class of Keycloak. And we're just supporting password with our user provider. If you support more than just a password with your user provider, you can configure it here. And this method just tests if when a user authenticates with a password, for example, if this user provider is suitable for using the password. So we're just returning the result of the supports credential type of this method in here is configured for. Then we have the isValid and update credential methods. I will come back to these later. I will skip these at first. And first of all, we have the get user by something methods. Get user by ID, get user by username, and get user by email. So these are called by Keycloak when working with the admin UI or when authenticating a user. These methods will be called from the user storage provider. And in our case, I just created a common method find user in this realm for a certain ID. And with this method storage ID, external ID of the Keycloak guy, this ID is the concatenated ID of the UUID of the federation provider and the ID of the external system. And to get just the external system, you can use this static method external ID. And yeah, this find user method here just gets an identifier, which may be the username, the email address, or the external ID. But the external ID is the same as the username in our example. And the API is capable of retrieving a user by username or email via the same endpoint. Yeah, we're just trying to retrieve the peanut by the identifier from our client, which we have defined here, get peanut by ID, just regular chucksrs syntax. And if we get some data back, if we don't get a web application exception, perhaps because the user is not found, 404, then a web application exception will be thrown by chucksrs. We're creating a new UserAdapter. The UserAdapter itself is a custom class implemented in your federation provider. And in this UserAdapter, you're implementing all the logic which is needed for handling the attributes, the roles, and the groups, and all this stuff. Our UserAdapter here in this example extends an abstract UserAdapter class where some methods are pre-configured, and so you only have to implement certain methods you really use. The abstract UserAdapter is kind of a read-only user, so the default methods for setting something are already implemented with default exceptions that the user is read-only. And the rest we can configure here. We have the constructor where we set the actual storage ID, again with these storage ID class. And we're constructing the storage ID for this user. And we're storing the peanut user itself in here as a class member in this class. And then we can operate on this instance of this peanut instance throughout our class when implementing the get username, get first name, get last name, get email methods, which are the special attributes for the user model in Keycloak. And then we have methods for handling the attributes itself. And important method is the get attributes method to return all the methods, all the attributes to in one map to Keycloak, including the username, email, first name, last name. And because these are special attributes, it's handled by Keycloak itself to extract them from the whole map. So when you're in Keycloak and looking at the users, at the attributes tab, you only see the birthday and the gender because Keycloak filters out the username, first name, last name, and email, although we have specified them all in this get attributes method. Then you should implement the get first attribute method because otherwise null is being returned as it's the default implementation. So please have a look at the default implementations of this abstract UserAdapter class you're extending, and get user attribute stream, pretty the same as the attributes, but as a stream. And then you have the option to implement methods for handling groups and roles. So the get groups internal and the get role mappings internal methods you can override. And in our case, I'm just returning the groups and the roles the external API delivers me back as a simple set or of role model or group models. And I created the group model and the role model as an interface. You have to implement your own classes. I just did some simple default implementation of these interfaces. There are no abstract classes available of these interfaces. And just a simple implementation, returning the name, and all the other things are throwing read-only exceptions that these role or group groups the same, the role pretty much the same, are only available for read operations, not for write operations. So from our UserAdapter back to the UserProvider class, we have the findUser method creating a new UserAdapter implementation. In this case, I put it to a map. First, I try to get the user already of this map if the user was retrieved before, just to minify API calls. And yeah, then we're returning the adapter, our own UserAdapter implementation, the user model to Keycloak, and Keycloak can handle this user model for us. So then further in this class, we have a getUsersCount method. Keycloak needs this to know how many users are stored in the external data source, to get the slices, how much users should be retrieved from per batch in the admin UI when managing the users. And then we have these methods for handling the user lists, or in this case, the users streams, because I implement the streams classes of this user provider. And yeah, we have several ways to get user streams of the user model of our UserAdapter. And also in this case, I have made a common to user model method where I map all the data, and depending on the method which is called, I call the client getPeanuts with search, first result, max results parameter if needed. And then I have this to user model stream. I just map all the list retrieved from the external API to a stream of user models, creating all so the various UserAdapter implementations or the instances of the UserAdapters for our use case. Then you have to also have to implement some methods for the group members. And if Keycloak is looking for group members, if you're dealing with groups, and you can implement here a method to get the users back which belong to a certain group. I skipped this in this example because I don't need it. And so I'm returning an empty stream, and also the search for user by user attribute stream. In my example, it's not needed, so I haven't implemented it, just returning an empty stream. Then the last two methods of this user provider are just for handling what happens if a new user will be registered in Keycloak by registration or from the administrator, if the administrator creates new users. And here we can determine if the user is stored in the external data source, and then returning a user model with the appropriate data. And if not, then just return null and the user is not stored. And Keycloak doesn't throw an error in such a case. And we have the remove user method, which is called when a user is removed, of course. So these are the methods for handling the users itself, the user data, the lists, the streams, and the single users, the getUserBySomething methods. And these methods are coming from the UserLookupProvider interface and the UserQueryProvider. UserQueryProvider are the user lists, user streams, and UserLookupProvider are the getUser by username, email, whatever. So for the UserProvider, you don't have to implement just one interface at most of the other SPIs in Keycloak. You have to implement several interfaces depending on your use case. So the common interface is the user storage provider. Then you have the user lookup provider to look up a certain user, a user query provider. So for example, if you don't need to handle a user through the admin UI, and you just want to provide an authentication for this user, then implementing the user lookup provider is enough. You don't have to implement the user query provider interface. This is only needed if you want to see a list of users in the admin UI or through the admin API. And the last two methods we saw at the bottom of this class, the add user and the remove user, are coming from the user registration provider, which handles if the user will be stored in the external data source and deleted or not. So then we have two interfaces left, and these are the credential input updater and the credential input validator. And as the names of these interfaces say, we can validate the credentials which are entered by the user, and we can update the credentials which are entered by the user. So if the user wants to update the password, we can propagate this new password, the change, up to the external data source, or when the user authenticates, we can just validate the entered data, the entered credential with the data from the external database. So let's start with the input validator. The input validator brings the isValid method. And in this isValid method, we're just checking if the entered credential is valid and verified against the data of the external data source. Again, in this example, I'm retrieving the credential data from the external system. And if we have a look to the API again, we get the credentials from Charlie, and you see we're getting an encrypted value. So no clear text password is transmitted here. It's just encrypted, and we have a salt, we have an algorithm, iterations, and the type. This is pretty the same data model Keycloak uses internally. You don't have to use the same model. You can use whatever you like, and perhaps you have to send the password to verify in clear text to the external system. Maybe that's if this is a requirement, yeah, you can do it, because at this point in the method, the isValid method, you have access to the password in clear text. So be very sensitive with this information. You get in this input, just have to look. You have this input, you're casting into a user credential model, you have this credential object, and credential get challenge response is the clear text password. So please be sensitive with this data. Don't expose it where it doesn't have to be exposed, or if you have to send it in clear text to some other system, be sure that the connection is encrypted with TLS, HTTPS, or whatever. So here you can compare the data. In my example, I'm retrieving the credential data, the encrypted credential data from the external system. So no clear text password is transmitted. And I just compare with the Keycloak built-in methods with the password credential model, password hash provider, and the verify method of this hash provider. If the password itself is valid, and if yes, I'm returning true, otherwise, of course, false, and nothing else is being exposed somewhere. So the same comes for the update credential method. The update credential method is from the credential input updater interface, and it's the same like isValid vice versa. You get the credential input from the user, and then you can create your payload to update the password in the external system. So in our case, I'm just creating a payload of exactly this structure here and encrypting the password in Keycloak with the PBKDF2 SHA-256 algorithm with the default iterations, and then sending the encrypted password with the salt to the external system with this method, the update credential data. So when I have here the credential data is just a Java bean with these attributes we just retrieved before in the isValid method. So, and the isValid method is called when the user authenticates. We already saw this when we switch back to Keycloak and start an authentication for a user, and entering the user and the password. The isValid method is called. The external data is being retrieved from Keycloak, from our provider, compared, verified, validated, and in our case it was valid. We can sign in, and if we just enter a wrong data, then we can't authenticate because validation failed in this case. And again, signed in. So compared to other provider implementations, other SPIs in Keycloak, we already saw pretty much code in this user storage provider. And the more code you write, nevertheless, every time you write code, you should test it. And the more code you write, the more you should test it. So how can you test all this stuff you just do here? I also wrote some tests, of course. I have the Peanuts user provider test. And as usual, I write my tests with the help of the Testcontainers-Keycloak implementation. And if you saw some of the other videos of me, you probably already know the Testcontainers-Keycloak implementation. If not, in the upper right corner, you see a link to the video of the Testcontainers-Keycloak project, which I'm a maintainer of. And in my test, I'm starting a pure fresh Keycloak container, configure it for my needs, and can test against this Keycloak container. So this is what I'm doing here. I'm just creating a new Keycloak container from the Test Containers project, importing a Peanuts realm, and deploying my UserStorageProvider classes, which are compiled to target classes. And I started in a certain network because I'm starting also another container. But before, we have a look to the Peanuts realm JSON. And in this Peanuts realm JSON, it's just a very tiny representation of the realm. It's called Peanuts, and the user storage provider is configured already in this JSON we are importing in our Keycloak container. And we have the Peanuts user provider. We just have an ID, and we have the base URL. It's an internal URL at the API host name. And we have the username Peanuts. So I have a password test, and the defaults, the cache policy priority. It's enabled so that it works. And that's all we have in this Peanuts realm JSON. And we have the compiled classes and target classes of our user provider. And we're starting it in the network together with a generic container of the image OpenAPI mock. And the OpenAPI mock is a container to mock an OpenAPI specification in a generic way, and together running a server with a working REST API defined by the OpenAPI specification. And I have this Peanuts API YAML in here, which is the specification of the API, which is deployed currently in AWS. And with this definition, a container is started, an OpenAPI mock container is started, and which uses this specification to create the endpoints, also in the same network. And I'll set a network alias to this API container named API, so that I can call this container via the API hostname from Keycloak. And this is what you saw here in the Peanuts realm. I'm calling the API through the API hostname because I'm setting it here as the network alias. Yeah, and then the containers are being started from test containers at the beginning of the tests, and the tests are being executed, just basic tests for accessing the realms, and then log in as user and check the access token if there are certain values contained in the payload of the token. Test login as a user with an invalid password, then we should get 401. Test accessing users as an administrator to query the user, to retrieve the user by ID, and all this stuff we're doing through the admin UI. We can also test here, automated, and yeah, everything works like a charm. And we can be sure to have a working user provider at this point. So just start these tests and look what happens. Just starting it in the IDE, and then the tests will be executed. Make the window a bit bigger. So the containers being started. You can see it here. Container is started, Keycloak is starting, the API container is already started. This is much more faster than the Keycloak container itself, and then the various tests starting to run. And as you can see at the left, all the tests are green, all the tests succeeding, and after the tests run, the containers are stopped again. So this is all what it takes to implement a simple but powerful user provider for connecting external user data, external user storage to Keycloak, and having the user data, the users being able to authenticate with Keycloak. Of course, you can extend it in every way you like. So you can add update functionality to update the user's data, the attributes in the external data source. You can split up the user storage so that you have some data stored or retrieved from the external data store and some data stored in the Keycloak, some attributes. And you can also extend it with synchronization functionality so that the data of the external provider is synced to Keycloak, also periodically synced to Keycloak, whether it's all the users or only some users which are all already available in Keycloak. And so this is for performance reasons, because the external system is perhaps a bit slower and does not have the best performance. So you can sync the user data to Keycloak and back. Important is the user storage provider. It's not necessarily for migrating users. You should do this in another way. But it's a good fit to connect external data sources, whether it's already existing or not, to Keycloak. So I hope you liked this video, and give me some thumbs up if yes, and subscribe to the channel, of course, so that you don't miss any of my future videos. I'm curious, what user providers do you use? Put in the comments, tell me your experience and your use cases, and yeah, hope to see you next time. Have a good time. See you. Bye bye.